Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are located. Welcome to today's Scrum Pulse webinar. I am Lindsay Valesina with Scrum.org, and I will be your moderator today. And today we have professional Scrum Trainer Mary Iqbal with us, and she is going to talk about how Scrum is not an excuse to ignore an emergency. So we are going to dive into this burning topic, and let's get started. So next slide, please. Thank you. So you will notice that your microphone is muted, and it will be muted throughout the session. However, we do encourage you to ask questions. So please utilize the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And then I ask you to please not ask your questions in the chat, because we're going to utilize that for some other things throughout the session. So again, please add your questions in the Q&A, and then we will have some other interactions in the chat. And just so that you all know, this will be recorded and it will be available within 24 hours. Next slide, please. All right, very quickly, a little bit about Scrum.org in case you are not all that familiar. We are the home of Scrum, and we were founded by Ken Schwaber in 2009. Our mission is to help people and teams solve complex problems, and we do so through our professional Scrum training, certification, and ongoing learning. We have over 350 professional Scrum trainers located globally, all teaching the same materials. And Mary is one of those professional Scrum trainers. We're so happy to have her today. And I'll hand it over to you, Mary, to get us started.
All right. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I appreciate it. I'm thrilled to be here with you today. So I want to start by introducing myself a little bit so you know who's talking to you today. My name is Mary Iqbal. I am an experienced Agile Transformation Manager with experience managing Agile Transformation for an organization with over 60 Agile teams. I'm also a Scrum.org professional Scrum trainer and the founder of Rebel Scrum, where I provide training. I've trained over 1,000 individuals in Agile frameworks, and I'm the organizer of this year's Scrum Day conference in Madison, Wisconsin, which is available at scrumday.org. So today we're here to talk about emergencies in Scrum. But before we get to that, I want to cover this idea of, at its base, at its base, Scrum delivers value incrementally. So every sprint, we're delivering something. So we may deliver something small, and then we add to it, and then we add to it, and we add to it. This idea of incremental delivery, delivering something usable every single sprint, is really at the heart of Scrum. The purpose of every sprint is to deliver a done increment that meets the sprint goal, a done usable increment that meets the sprint goal. And that's what we're doing here. And that's the purpose of every sprint. Every sprint is an agreement, right? In order to allow the Scrum team to deliver that increment of usable, valuable functionality, the organization and the Scrum team have sort of a tacit agreement. And the idea is the organization doesn't interrupt the sprint unless it's necessary. And in return, the Scrum team works together to deliver a usable increment every sprint, right? Because every sprint, we need a little bit of time, right? We need some uninterrupted time to be able to focus on the work of the Scrum team. And we're committing to that goal every sprint of delivering a usable increment that meets the sprint goal. And it's from this, right? All of Scrum's key benefits actually come from this idea of incremental delivery. We're increasing visibility, right? Because every sprint, the Scrum team is delivering something. We are maintaining a higher ability to change direction, because every sprint, right? We don't have a lot of half-done work. We deliver something, it's done, and then we move on to the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. And so that's where this ability to change direction comes from. Every sprint, we finish something. And if we need to change direction at that point, it's a lot easier to change direction when you don't have a lot of half-done work just sitting sitting in progress. So that ability to change comes from this idea of incremental delivery. Delivering business value sooner comes from this idea as well, because we're delivering something, right? It may not be the whole thing that you're looking for, but it's a step in that direction. So we're getting value sooner to the customer. And we're also reducing risk, because by working this way, we're finding out any issues that may be unexpected, right? We're going to find out about technical issues a lot sooner. So imagine that you're building a web application, and it's really a web form with 5,000 fields. In the old way of working, you might have build the database for all 5,000 fields, and then build the middleware for all 5,000 fields. And then you might finally do the front-end user interface. If the front-end user interface doesn't work with the database, you might not discover it until after you put all that work into it. But if you're delivering value incrementally, you're going to find that out a lot sooner. So you may be asking, why am I talking about incremental delivery when we're talking about emergencies? The reason is it goes back to that idea of the tacit agreement between the Scrum teams and the stakeholders. We need to enable to get these benefits from a Scrum. We need to leave the Scrum team room to work every sprint, room to focus on the work of the sprint, and room to focus on their commitment for delivering that incremental value every sprint. And yet, even with all that I've said about the importance of incremental delivery and its fundamental impacts on our ability to deliver value to the customer and get these benefits from Scrum, even so, we can't ignore emergencies. Sometimes things happen, right? There are emergencies that happen, and we can't just ignore that. So I really have worked with product owners when there was an emergency and their response was, well, we're in the middle of the sprint, too bad, right? We can't say that, right? The real world, we need to be able to deal with this. So, if you've got a real code red and you're in the middle of the sprint, just saying, oh, we're doing Scrum doesn't make that emergency go away. We need to find out, how are we going to deal with this? So I'm going to take a pause and ask you in the chat, this time in the chat, what are some emergencies, real or perceived, that you have encountered in your day-to-day lives, right? When I say real or perceived, sometimes there's an emergency, right? That's not really an emergency. And sometimes there's emergencies that really are real. So I'd like to ask you in the chat, if you could, put some thoughts. What are some emergencies that you have encountered? So for example, I'll start by sharing, right? There could be just a request, right? A change of direction from the customer that says, this is emergency, we want this new feature, right? It may or may not be an emergency. There could be cases of, hey, we've got the whole system's down. That's an emergency. Machine is down. So I'm gonna look at a few here. So we've got some thoughts coming in, changing requirements. Let's see here. Changing requirements, changing goals, right? A P1, priority 1 bug, customers can't send in orders, a must-have defect, changing requirements, impediments, production outages, oh, brutal, software down, ooh, a new pitch, yeah, that can be an emergency, right? Emergencies don't have to be negative. There is, I'm gonna say positive emergencies too, right? We've got a new presentation. Change requests, applications not running, changed in another application that has a huge impact on your product. Developers on the team have to go handle a production issue that takes away from their current effort. Changing requirements, bug fixes, member impacting, fraud occurring. Ooh, yeah, somebody's committing fraud and we need to fix that. We need to stop that. A single user can't log on. Could be an emergency, depends. Vendor dependency, delay for the hardware supplier, lots of emergencies. We have bugs. I won't keep reading each one, but billing issues, privacy laws, right? New changes in laws, right? There's things that can happen from a regulatory perspective, right? And a new law comes into effect, and we're going to have to, take that seriously. Stock goes down, misunderstanding of requirements between dev and customers. So we deal with emergencies, and having, saying that we're using Scrum is not an excuse to not deal with the emergencies. So there's this kind of urban legend about, I have this image here on the screen, Bloody Mary, right? You say that name 3 times fast and the emergency goes away. That's not what happens, right? If I say Scrum 3 times fast, that emergency doesn't go away. Just because I want to deliver work in sprints and there's legitimate reasons for that, doesn't mean I never have an emergency. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about 3 ways for you to deal with production emergencies. So the first thing that there's really 3 options here. The first option is postpone the work. So the emergency comes in, the product owner receives this request, and the product owner looks at it and says, it's not really an emergency, right? You've got to use your own judgment as the product owner and make a decision. Is this really an emergency? That's not an easy position to be in, right? The product owner is really in the hot seat. Somebody's coming to them and saying, hey, this is an emergency. We've got to stop all ships. And the product owner has to look at that and say, is it really an emergency? A skilled product owner knows that when you interrupt the sprint, you're actually delaying value delivery, or you're putting value delivery at risk. You're adding unnecessary turbulence to the Scrum team. So using judgment to decide, is this really an emergency, is something that the product owner can do. The request comes in and they decide, yes, this is an emergency, that's a different thing. But they can say, no, we're going to stay the course. I'm going to add that to the product backlog, or not, but I'm going to add that to the product backlog, and we'll consider that for future sprints. So the product owner option one is they can simply say, no, this is not an emergency, and we're going to stay the course. So I'm going to ask the question, have you been in situations where the product owner said, that's not really an emergency? Throw that in the chat. Okay, lots, fantastic, right? That's not an easy thing to do. Thank you guys for putting some chats out there. It's not, oh, we got one no, right? Interesting. So it's not an easy thing to do, right? To say no when someone's saying this is an emergency. But we do need that product owner to have that sense of empowerment, right? The product owner owns the product. That means their purpose is to maximize value delivery. And sometimes that does mean saying no to something so that they can say yes to something else. An emergency is a request for work. And the product owner does need to have that, to feel the empowerment to say, no, not at this time, or no, I'm going to put it on the backlog, but it's not my top priority. So having that empowerment is really important. The entire organization needs to respect the product owner's decisions with respect to the content and ordering of the product backlog. And sometimes the answer is no, not at this time. So option one, the product owner can look at it and say, no, we're not going to do that at this time. But that's not the appropriate response all the time. Sometimes an emergency comes in and the product owner says, yeah, that's kind of urgent, right? And in those cases, the product owner may decide to come to the product, to come to the Scrum team, to have a conversation with the developers and ask the question, can we add this to the current sprint without putting the sprint goal at risk? So this is a conversation that the product owner would have with the developers. Now, remember, there's a balance of power, right, between the developers and the product owner. The developers own the sprint backlog. So this is a conversation. This is not a demand. The product owner goes to the developers and says, hey, is this something that we can add to the current sprint without putting the sprint goal at risk? Now, keep in mind, when this happens, the Scrum team may come back and said, yes, we can add it if we take this lower priority thing out. And that's a conversation that happens between the product owner and the developers. So it is okay to remove some items, some selected product backlog items from the sprint if that conversation happens between the product owner and the developers. So one thing I would add to this, though, is you don't want to be adding work if you're going to be putting the sprint goal at risk. So that's option two, adding to the current sprint without putting the sprint goal at risk. So let me ask the question, have you experienced this one? Is this something that you've experienced? Okay, we've got a few yeses coming, definitely. Okay, I thought I saw somebody that says often. Okay, so yes, we've had this every other sprint. Ooh, right? So we need to use some judgment, right? The product owner really needs to limit this, right? If we're doing it every sprint, that's a problem. I have a question about a sprint goal. Yes, sprint goal, question mark. Every sprint, the Scrum team should be establishing a sprint goal, which describes the purpose of the sprint. And that is something that's created at the sprint planning event. I had someone that says yes today. So yeah, you can add to the current sprint, but this should not be an every sprint sort of situation. Or if it is, it's I shouldn't say never, right? There's no such thing as never, but it's not something that is ideal, adding to the sprint. It needs to be something where the product owner puts in consideration, because every time you add to the sprint, you're adding a little bit of turbulence. Okay, so option three, that's option one. We talked about option two. Option three would be canceling the sprint. Now, this is rare. In my many years of using Scrum, I've actually never had this one happen. But there is the possibility that if a real emergency comes up and it puts the current sprint, it makes the current sprint obsolete, then it's possible that the product owner may decide to cancel the sprint. Let me give you some examples because this is extremely rare. If something comes up, for example, that there's a Scrum team working on the iPhone, the BlackBerry, and the iPhone comes out. Well, that's an emergency. Maybe we need to rethink, and maybe our current sprint really is obsolete because of this new market change that has happened, right? Then you might consider canceling the sprint if your current goal becomes obsolete. Another example, if you have an urgent customer change come up that really blows everything else that you're working with out of the water and you no longer need those things, then you might cancel the sprint. Only the product owner has the authority to make this decision that we're going to cancel the sprint. And it's very, very rare. Like I said, I have never had this happen to me, but this is an option. If that thing came up and it's really urgent, you would cancel the sprint. And if it made the current sprint goal obsolete, you can cancel the sprint, reassess, and kick off your next sprint. So I'm going to ask you, I expect this to be rare, but has anyone had this happen to you where the sprint goal actually became obsolete? Once in 10 years. Okay. Most folks are saying never, never, no, yes, couple yeses, never yet, not yet, right? Okay, yeah, so most folks are saying never. Once business decided to shut down the product, okay? All right, so this is a very rare, we have once in 5 years, never experienced it. Okay, we have a question about some examples of a sprint goal. Okay, so most folks have said never. I want to answer that question. One person asked for some examples of a sprint goal. Examples of a sprint goal really are very contextual, right? The sprint goal is a step towards the product goal. So an example might be, build a new web form. That's a pretty small one. Or, we want to launch this new form, or we want to launch this new thing, or we want to fix this big production defect. It's really something that describes what's the purpose of the sprint. What are we mostly trying to accomplish? That's an example of a sprint goal. All right, so summing that up, right? 3 options, and really all depend. You may have noticed a common thread with these emergencies. All of these emergencies are at the discretion of the product owner. So number 1, the product owner can say, nope, that's not an emergency. I'll put it on the backlog or not, and we'll consider it for future sprints. Option 2 was a negotiation, right? This is really important. It's urgent. We couldn't have foreseen this. So the product owner goes to the developers and says, hey, can we add this to the current sprint without putting our current sprint goal at risk? So that's option 2. And option 3 would be canceling the sprint. And this, again, very, very rare. So those are the 3 options that you could have. I want to ask you all a quick poll, right? How often are you experiencing real emergencies, right? So if you could, do I need to stop sharing, Lindsay, for you to do this poll?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
So let me pull up the poll here.
This time we're going to do this in a poll. So we're not going to do the chat. This time we're going to do an actual poll. And Lindsay's going to be starting that up in just a moment here. How often are you experiencing emergencies? Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay. So a poll should have popped up for you in Zoom. If you could take a moment. How often are you experiencing real emergencies? Always, every sprint? Or is it very frequently? So maybe every other sprint, occasionally, rarely, very rarely, or a never. Okay, I'll give you just a moment to respond to that.
Okay, it's starting to slow down. I'll give another moment.
While we're waiting for that, I think I'll just answer a couple of these questions that have come in through the Q&A. One of the questions is, should the team have one sprint goal or a few sprint goals, such as put this data on UI or save data to database? Okay, so the answer to that one is every sprint, the Scrum team should establish one sprint goal that really describes what is the main purpose of the sprint. So imagine you're at sprint planning. The team selects these 10 product backlog items that we're going to deliver this sprint. You create a plan for how you're going to deliver it. Patty's going to do this. George is going to do that. So you've got your plan. you're going to also establish what's our goal, right? What's the main thing we want to accomplish this sprint? And the sprint goal does not have to incorporate every last product backlog item. So for example, if we are, we're painting my living room, thank you so much, right? And if we're painting my living room, we're redecorating, something like that. But we've also got some random other things like mow the yard or whatever. If the main thing we want to accomplish is paint the living room, that's the goal, right? Even if I have a few other little random things in there. The purpose of the sprint goal is to add focus for the sprint so that when an emergency comes up, we can take a look and say, all right, well, this emergency, is it more important than the sprint goal? No, then it's not really an emergency. And we're going to put that on the backlog for a future sprint. So that's the idea. So you should have just a single sprint goal, one sprint goal per sprint, and it should describe the purpose of the sprint.
Okay, we have our results, so you should be able to see them now.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so we have always every sprint at just 6%. I'm happy to see that. Very frequently, every other sprint at 16%. It's pretty high. Occasionally at 42%. That's really hard to say. 42%. Rarely at 24%. Very rarely at 10%, and never at 1%. Right? Because there are emergencies. Right? You can't say that there's never an emergencies. In complex products, I'm a little surprised the never's that low. That's fantastic. Congratulations to you. So, wow. All right. So never, actually, that does make sense, actually. Never would be 1%. So that does make sense. All right. So thank you for that, Lindsay. I appreciate it. All right. So you're having emergencies, right? 1% of you very never, but most of us do have emergencies, at least occasionally. So how can we as a Scrum team reduce emergencies so that we can focus on delivering a value increment of usable product every sprint? How can we reduce those emergencies? I'm going to talk about 2 ways to reduce emergencies. The first one is the product owner should brainstorm with the Scrum team to add fixes to common emergencies to the product backlog. So during your refinement, however you're doing refinement, whether it's once a week, twice a week, whatever it is, you should take a look and discuss recent emergencies, right? We've had this priority 1 bug, for example, and we had to interrupt the sprint with it. What can we do to prevent those types of emergencies in the future? And have a discussion at refinement. And those fixes, those preventative measures should be added to the product backlog. For example, right? If your emergency is frequently the batch jobs stop running, right? Maybe the product owner can have a conversation with developers and say, look, how can we prevent these batch jobs from failing? And the answer may be, hey, we need to go in and rewrite some portions of it. That can be added to the product backlog and ordered alongside other work. So often product owners think that technical debt like that is the developer's problem, but it's not. It's the whole team's problem, including the product owner. If the product owner's job is to maximize value, that can mean doing maintenance like that to prevent future emergencies. Maybe rewriting some portions of the code if you're a software product, or maybe filing some paperwork if you're a human resources team, or whatever it is, but some way to prevent common emergencies. And that's a conversation you can have in refinement. It's a conversation you can have really at any time that makes sense for you. For example, in the retrospective, if the team is dealing with frequent emergencies, they might have a conversation about that. How can we prevent these types of emergencies? Is there anything we can add to the product backlog to prevent common emergencies in the future? Again, the product owner should care about this. They're the product owner, not the new feature owner, right? The entire product is something that they're accountable for. And that can include doing some maintenance, right? Maybe we need to add code comments to the code to reduce the severity of future emergencies. Maybe we need to reorganize our code, whatever it is, but adding those fixes to the product backlog and ordering the product backlog so that those fixes get done in a timely manner is part of the product owner's accountability. So I'm going to ask you, are you having these conversations on your teams? Are you discussing this in refinement and adding those to your product backlog? Okay, and while you're putting those chats out there, I'll say, yes, I've got a question on, will the session recording be available? Yes, it will be. You can go to, I think it's under resources, the same place that you went to sign up for this, the recording will be there. Okay. All right, so you are having these conversations. I encourage you to have these conversations with your product owner and ensure that these fixes are added to your product backlog. So that is addressing current problems, right? Adding those to the product owner, adding fixes for common problems to your product backlog. Another thing that you can and absolutely should do is take a look at your definition of done. Your definition of done should be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. And having a good definition of done can prevent the creation of future emergencies. So a definition of done is a common understanding of all the things we need to do for every product backlog item before we can consider it done. So for example, for a software product, your definition of done may include things like we need to complete a code review before we close product backlog items, right? We need to ensure that we've done all regression testing before a product backlog item is closed. It's a common understanding of everything that needs to be done for every product backlog item before it can be considered done. And the developers are accountable for making sure that before they close this product backlog item, that it's done, that it meets our definition of done. Now, I want to comment here that let's say that you have configuration changes and you have a mix of development changes. Sometimes things on your definition of done don't apply, and that's okay. But it's really important that you do have a definition of done and that everyone on the Scrum team or everyone supporting the same product knows what it is, that it's well communicated, well understood. And also understand that that definition of done will expand to become more stringent over time. As the team gets better at delivering value, they're going to want to also get better at delivering a high quality product. And so that definition of done does need to expand. Whereas in the early days of the product, you may not have been able to conduct regression testing. When you can, you're going to add that to your definition of done. But that definition of done can prevent future emergencies. So for example, if you had an emergency recently that customer data was at risk, you add fixes to that to prevent that in the future to your product backlog. But then you update your definition of done to include additional security reviews so that this doesn't happen in the future. It's really important that we be very deliberative about how we support our product, strategic, making sure that we fix the issue and then prevent the creation of similar issues in the future. So that definition of done is really important. Keep in mind that if the IT organization may have a definition of done that all Scrum teams have to adopt at a minimum. And then also, if there are more than one Scrum team supporting a single product, they should share a common definition of done. So when you make updates to that definition of done, you need to make sure that it's updated for all Scrum teams supporting the same product. So I think at this time, Lindsay, I'd like to move over to some of the questions that we've had come in.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, let's move over to questions.
Okay. So this question from Pradeep. If a PO takes a decision that turns out to be wrong afterward and the developers were not in agreement with the PO, what can the PO do to make sure that they are still relevant and respected by the team?
Great question. So we're all human, right? And sometimes being in that hot seat, being in the product owner, you're not going to make the perfect decision every time. So I think it's really important that the product owner can acknowledge that, hey, maybe this wasn't a great idea, and we're going to take a different direction next time. Or maybe it was the right idea at the time, based on the information that they had. But being open to feedback is really important. It's one of the 5 Scrum values is openness, which means openness to other people's ideas and other feedback, acknowledging that, hey, maybe that wasn't the right decision. Maybe we made the best decision we could at the time, but it wasn't the right decision. So we need to change directions. And that is actually the power of Scrum, right? It is okay to change direction. Every sprint, we can take a different tack if we need to, and adjust based on what we learn over time. That's the beauty of Scrum, empiricism. We're transparent, we inspect frequently and adapt. We're able to adapt, and there's nothing wrong with adapting, actually. That's why we use Scrum. That's why we use Agile, is because we work in complex environments. We live in a complex world. And to say that we're never going to make a decision that was wrong, right, is just unrealistic. So it's okay, and no shame on the product owner. It's just they need to be able to adapt. So embrace empiricism, live it, love it. It's fine.
Great, thank you. All right, this question from Alan. Hi, Mary. Is amending the sprint goal an option based on new emergencies, or is that cheating a bit?
That is cheating. Yes, that's cheating. I would say rather than amend the sprint goal, if you really are in a position where you're amending the sprint goal, what you're really doing is canceling the current sprint and going a different direction. So no, I wouldn't amend the sprint goal. I would just acknowledge that, hey, this is a real emergency. We're canceling the current sprint. Here's our new goal. And it should be very rare, very, very rare. In that, before I did that, I would certainly go with option number 2, which was have a discussion to see if we can add work to the current sprint without putting our current sprint goal at risk.
Great, thank you. All right, if an unexpected bug prevents users from using our product and our sprint goal was about adding value, new functionality to that product, can it be considered as a sprint goal becoming obsolete?
You could. So there's a couple ways you can handle that. In that case, you could start with option 2. Can we add this fix to our current sprint without putting the sprint goal at risk? It depends on how much effort it's going to take to fix that. So I can tell you, sometimes you get an emergency that comes in, the system's down, and it may take an hour to fix it. And in a 2-week sprint, an hour won't put your sprint goal at risk, most likely. Or it may be something that takes 2 weeks to fix, in which case, yeah, you're gonna have to cancel the sprint and work on that. So it just completely depends on the situation and how much work it's gonna take for the developers to solve that production issue. But it all starts with the conversation, right? The product owner is gonna have to have a conversation with the developers and figure out, can we do option 2, or are we talking about canceling the sprint and addressing this?
Great, thank you. All right, this question from Sarah. We had real bad performance issues in our software last sprint, so that only the last 10 days out of a 4-week sprint, we could work on our actual sprint goal. Would it have been better in this case to cancel the sprint?
I hesitate to comment without knowing even more information, although it sounds like from your description that potentially it might have been, but I wouldn't want to comment upon that because it depends on how important the sprint goal is compared to these performance issues. For example, maybe the sprint goal is to address performance issues, right? And then you wouldn't cancel the sprint. That's your sprint goal. So I just feel like I couldn't really hard and fast say without really having that conversation with the product owner and the developers, but maybe.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, without a PO, a Scrum Master can make these decisions?
Oh, brutal. No, I mean, I would certainly encourage you to identify a product owner for that team. It's really important that all 3 accountabilities should be fulfilled on the Scrum team. So it's okay for people to fulfill multiple accountabilities. You could have the product owner accountability be filled by the same person who's fulfilling a Scrum Master accountability. So people can wear multiple hats, but it is really important that there be someone fulfilling that accountability. Otherwise, who's to determine what is an emergency? You're going to be like a ship without a rudder going every which way directions, right? You're not going to have any focus. It's going to be a rough experience. So I certainly encourage somebody should fulfill that accountability, and it can be one of the developers. It can be a Scrum Master, or you can pull in someone from the business and say, hey, can you fulfill this accountability? It's really important for us to have a single to-do list, a single product backlog that we're going to work from. We need a product goal, we need a vision. All of those things are really important. So I would establish a product owner for sure.
Thank you. Right, so should the team have one sprint goal, a few sprint goals, such as put this data on UI, save data for data, save data to database, complete the server side change, etc.?
Okay, so that one I would say definitely one sprint goal at a time. That sprint goal should be the main thing that you want to accomplish that sprint. And as we discussed a little bit earlier, it may not incorporate every single last thing that's in the sprint. Maybe it's just the most important thing, and that's okay. But the goal provides the focus, and there should be only one.
Thank you. And that one, Mary, just so that, apologize audience for the side note. This is not one of the ones that you answered earlier, correct? Because I was busy with the poll.
It might be. That's okay.
Okay. All right. So how do you handle team members getting pulled off to work on emergencies or asked to work them on the side?
Right.
That takes away the PO having the power to make the decision and definitely causes turbulence.
Right. So it is important that the Scrum team remain consistent over time. So I think with that one, we would definitely need to have further conversation around that. It may be lots of different things could be causing this. Maybe the product is not well defined, right? Maybe we don't understand the left and right limits of the product. We need to have that conversation. Is it that the Scrum team members really are being pulled off to support another product? I might want to have a conversation with the Scrum team. How do they want to handle this? The other Scrum team may need to have a conversation. Perhaps they need to expand their own skill sets so that they're not causing these problems, but it really is very contextual. I would want to have a conversation about that, but it's not a great situation. When the Scrum team is inconsistent over time, it's really like you're going back to the beginning, right? In terms of, the level of accomplishment of the team. So I want to just say, I want to take only maybe one or two more questions, and then I think we'll wrap up. But just know, for those of you who put questions in the chat, and if I wasn't able to get to them this time, I am going to be responding via email because I think this is a really important topic. So I'm definitely going to respond to all your questions, even if I don't get to them today. So Lindsay, let's just do one or two more, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. All right. Okay. So how do you handle support requests during the sprint? I assume that the sprint goal is more important, but would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so great question. So support requests, it does a little bit depend. If it's some Scrum teams will establish this idea that certain types of requests are not handled within the sprint. So this is a conversation that you want to have with your Scrum team. But for the most part, I would say support requests should be put on the product backlog and ordered by the product owner, so that we can determine, is this really something that we, what is the importance of this item for the team? So it can be ordered alongside other work. So I would go with option one on that one. Put it on the product backlog and determine where in the list it resides.
Okay.
Some teams will establish like a minimum though. If it's less than an hour, they may decide that certain types of requests are something that the Scrum team does handle, but I would be cautious with that.
Makes sense. Okay. Right. I
have had Scrum teams wind up with, if they do that, sometimes Scrum teams will wind up with 90% of their time spent on support requests that aren't really emergencies or aren't really that urgent. So I would encourage, put as much of that as possible on the product backlog and let the product owner use their discretion to determine, hey, is this really more important than something else we're doing?
All right. Sorry, I lost my spot in the question queue. There's so many great questions here. Right. So do you estimate emergencies? Right now, we add them as unplanned emergency and no estimate.
Great question. So sizing is something very dependent for each Scrum team. And I realize that a lot of my answers are, it does depend. So for emergencies, first off, you don't have to size. You can use flow metrics just in general. But for emergencies, it is something that you would go back to having a conversation with the Scrum team. So I don't know that I would estimate it, but for an emergency, the product owner, receives this emergency. The first thing they're going to do is first determine whether it is emergency. If it is, the product owner would have a conversation with the Scrum team and say, is this something that is achievable to add to the current sprint? So whether you at that point estimate it or not is immaterial. What you're having the conversation of, can it be done with the current sprint without putting the current sprint goal at risk? So whether you estimate it or not is, either way you want to do it is fine. Okay. So Lindsay, I think at this point, I would like to go ahead and wrap up.
Okay.
And I can answer some of these questions offline. Definitely take a look at my website, Rebel Scrum. And if you want to send me questions there, you can. Otherwise, I will be actually going through your questions and responding to you via email.
Okay, perfect.
All right, so we've done our questions. Lindsay, I guess I'm going to pass the ball over to you to wrap us up here.
Fantastic. All right. So please, we always encourage you to continue your learning, and our website has a ton of resources. We have learning paths on our website as well as other resources you could search our resource center for. So please feel free to check those out. Those have webinars like this one and white papers, case studies, all kinds of things to help you with your learning. So please feel free to check those out. Okay, and we encourage you to connect with our community. So please follow us on social media and follow our blog. Mary has some great ones on our blog, so definitely check those out, as well as check out our other Scrum Pulse webinars. Next week, we will be doing a webinar on our new Scrum Master self-assessment with comparative agility, to learn a little bit about that and how self-assessment can help you grow your skills. So please feel free to check that out. And with that, Mary, I think you had something else that you wanted to talk about quick.
Yes, I just want to mention that, excuse me, I just want to mention that I am the organizer of this year's Scrum Day event. So if you are interested, if you're in the Madison, Wisconsin area, please go to scrumday.org to learn more about some of our great speakers and sign up. We'd love to see you. And
Fantastic.
with that, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun for me. I've definitely enjoyed your questions. I definitely appreciate your participation and thoughtfulness, because that's what makes this a better experience for everyone when you engage.
Thanks, everybody. All right, so we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you again, Mary, for this great session, and Scrum on.